No problem. So about 4 years ago, I was sniffing around our state archives. I was there doing some of historical research for my PhD. I was actually there looking for data related to King George whiting and our historical fishery for that species. However, what I inadvertently found as I was going through some of our records was a couple of diaries from our Inspector of Fisheries in the late 1800s. Most people don't know that we had an Inspector of Fisheries back then, but we actually had a very active inspector who was focused on our historical fishery for the native oyster Ostrea angarzi. What I then started to see was all of these records about the management that he was recommending, as well as some of his discussion about the status of native oyster reefs. I collated all of this data and I actually formed a bit of a timeline about that, and what you can see up here is effectively a condensed version of a timeline about the historical oyster fishery for native angarzi in South Australia. You can see it started basically when we had European colonisation. This is in relation to our commercial fishery and European settlers. We actually had the first introduction of fisheries legislation in 1853. Now that's much earlier than some people realise, and it's actually 4 years before South Australia even attained Parliament. So that legislation was made in England. We had further legislation in 1873 and 1881. In 1881 we had the inspector appointed. In 1885 we had further legislation. If you follow through there, and you can see the pictures on the left-hand side actually really capture the essence of what did that fishery look like and how did they actually operate the fishery. But if you follow that down, you can see that the inspector starts to talk about and makes a recommendation that all further fishing should be stopped on oyster reefs. What he'd noticed is that basically these oyster reefs were failing. That means that they were failing to produce any more oysters. Basically, they were overexploited. Going back just a little bit further, there was a report in 2009 and 2011 which actually articulated some of this loss of oyster reefs around the world. Approximately 85% of oyster reefs have been lost worldwide. That report did articulate that in southern Australia more than 99% of shellfish reefs had been lost. That means that they're functionally extinct. However, it's fair to say that there wasn't a lot of focus in Australia about the outcomes and the implications of that report. So what I also started to do was look at in what locations did they talk about commercial fishing. All of those locations, and that's simply locations of commercial fishing, came to 67. 67 locations covering more than 1,500 kilometres of the South Australian coastline. It's fair to say that I don't think most people realise just how extensive that fishing was. You can see that the fleet up in the photograph of the boats, the fleet actually roved from one end of the state to the other. We had fishing on the far west coast of the bay, We had fishing on Kangaroo Island, and we had fishing in the upper Spencer Gulf. What does that actually mean for South Australia? When we start to think about that scale of commercial fishing, obviously it's quite extensive. What we also saw was this really steep decline of commercial fishing at the turn of the century. Those two graphs up there are the records of the Inspector of Fisheries in terms of the commercial catch. In the number of bags of oysters, there's approximately 350 oysters per bag. And you can see that there's quite a steep decline from 1886 onwards. That's basically the collapse of the fishery. It collapsed the number of boats, the number of licences. So the number of boats and the number of fishers actually engaged also collapsed. What we actually think occurred is that with these graphs, we don't actually think that we've captured that full decline. We actually think that prior to 1886, the annual catch of oysters was much higher. The reason why we think that is this, the map on the right-hand side here, and this was found in, I always tell people, it's found in a miscellaneous box of files. If you see those in the archives, they're always the juiciest. Make sure you go for those first. It was a random piece of paper, and it's a map that shows that the inspector wanted to close off half of Gulf St Vincent, or approximately a third, and open up another third of Gulf St Vincent to fishing. That map, which was produced in 1885, illustrates potentially just how extensive those oyster reefs were. What we think has happened is that because the fishery collapsed prior to 1900, basically just the passing of time, changes in our focus on industries and changes in community perception have actually led to the fact that we've forgotten about their past distribution. We've forgotten just how extensive they were. This can actually be validated by the fact that you can see how many oysters they were actually catching. If I was to say to you, how many do you think they would actually catch? One of the best records we have, and unfortunately it wasn't collected by the inspector, so it's not up there. These are simply catch examples of catch or catch per unit effort. But one of the best examples we have is that out on Orontes Bank, out in Gulf St Vincent, if people know it, there's actually a sort of anecdotal reference of 100,000 oysters per week being taken from Orontes Bank. The country who's most active around trying to recover some of the loss that's occurred for shellfish reefs is the USA. And I think most people in this room, if you have a marine interest, you would have heard about shellfish reef restoration in the US. As of yesterday, and this is the website of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as of yesterday they've got listed up there 531 shellfish reef restoration projects. That's projects that NOAA are investing in. That's not all projects, so there's further ones that are being done by private enterprise as well as community groups. However, NOAA are invested in 531 projects. That means their own money, means they're actively involved. One of the other things that they've just released, and that was last year, is this new National Shellfish Initiative. That initiative really tries to capture the broad-scale implications of shellfish and basically has the short vision of trying to increase the number of shellfish, the number of bivalves in the water. What's really interesting though, and you can see the last sentence there about how NOAA recognises the broad suite of economic, social and environmental benefits that are provided by increasing shellfish populations. They actually included their new jobs and business opportunities, meeting the growing demand for seafood, pardon me, habitat for important commercial, recreational, endangered and threatened species, species recovery, cleaner water and nutrient removal and shoreline protection. There's some pretty broad values. Going into the ecosystem benefits specifically about restoration, what's the value of shellfish reefs? Why would the USA want to actually do restoration? There's the intrinsic value of actually putting back the habitat and the species that we've lost. So if we've overexploited shellfish reefs and oyster reefs, we have the value of actually putting them back in and recovering that habitat. More broadly, we see improved water quality, as well as having improved water quality. That obviously then supports surrounding habitats such as seagrasses and kelps. Shellfish reefs produce wave energy, they stabilise sediment, they also create a really complex habitat. It's very good for biodiversity and it's actually really good for fish as well. The other thing that the US have really noticed, and it comes back to that broad range of values that they articulated through this national initiative, is the fact that there's a lot of economic and social outcomes. You get economic returns on restoration or through restoration because you're involving local construction companies in actually doing the works. You get social outcomes because you're involving the community, you're involving volunteers in doing the works, and those pictures up there really capture just how successful this type of work can be in that broader sense of community. So what could we do in South Australia? What we now know is that we've lost shellfish reefs from really extensive areas of the South Australian coastline. We know that this happened well in the past. It happened over 150 years ago. We also know that we've had further impacts, and here I've used the example of Gulf St Vincent through some of the Scoresby Shepherds and Reg Spriggs work. We know that we've actually lost further hard substrate and benthic communities in Gulf St Vincent. That happened after this loss of shellfish reefs. Now we've got the opportunity with spatial planning, marine conservation initiatives, as well as habitat restoration and the knowledge that this is something we can do. We've actually got the opportunity to put that back into the environment, put oyster reefs back in. What we're going through is some of those questions about can we increase the abundance and diversity of native shellfish? Can native shellfish reefs actually be restored? One of the problems that we've got is with a 99% loss, we've actually got to the point where we're both larval and substrate limited. That means we don't have enough oysters and we don't have enough hard substrate. And in particular, are there innovative solutions that we can use to try and achieve some of these objectives? One of the projects we have is the SA Habitat Enhancement project. This is a state government election commitment to implement an artificial reef trial for recreational fishing. We've actually taken that opportunity to say we're not going to use tyres, we're not going to put in big structures that will aggregate fish. What we think is the best option is to incorporate shellfish reef restoration into this project so that we produce fish. We know that we can produce fish through shellfish reef restoration. This is new work that I wanted to highlight because we understand that through recreating this habitat, which is very complex and diverse and productive, we know that it will actually increase fish. However, the numbers have only just become available for that. I'd encourage people to try and track down this paper if you can and have a bit of a read. What it actually articulates is that there is direct increases in the 0+ and 1+ age classes of fish. They've actually identified 19 and 12 species variously for the Gulf of Mexico and the Mid-Atlantic in the USA. Those 0+ and 1+, the increases in the 0+ and 1+ age classes are in perpetuity. They are for the life of the reef, so you're increasing production through time. How are we going to do that? We're going to use a range of substrates. We're going to seed it with native oysters through either the use of hatcheries or by actually putting out native oysters onto the reef, and then we're going to let it grow over time. It's pretty straightforward. The other thing that we're actually doing is trying to take the opportunity to scale up this work. We're focusing on economic values. It's not a square peg in a round hole, as you saw with the US. This is valid work. They know in the US that they can actually achieve as many as 30 jobs per $1 million invested in this work. That resonates with our current South Australian government needs around jobs and economic opportunities. We've actually had some analysis done by EconSearch, one of our economic data providers, that indicates the number of jobs, direct and indirect, can be as high as 8.6 per $1 million invested in South Australia. Interestingly, that's higher than other industry developments, such as horticulture expansion 4.8 and 2.5 for mine development. How we're actually wrapping that up, and this is sort of the punchline, is we've got a short project going at the moment through PIRSA, JUNA and the Nature Conservancy, in which we're trying to capture, I guess, the concept or the vision for what is this economic as well as environmental value around this work. The Blue Infrastructure Initiative, as it's called, is our term. This is natural infrastructure, sometimes called green infrastructure. In South Australia, we're going to say it's blue infrastructure, and we're looking at the key outcomes we can actually achieve. This work is unfolding at the moment. It's a bit of a vision, and what we're also doing is putting together the business case that will sit underneath this work. That's it, but I'd be very welcome to actually talk with people further, either in lunch or to actually see the work unfold and get some further ideas.
Thank you. So we've got time for 2 questions, if we've got them, please.
Thank you. Heidi, great talk and fantastic initiative. Are you right? Yep. Just wondering, as you've gone through this process, you would have gone through a risk assessment. From that perspective, in terms of ecological risk, what do you think the greatest ones are for these large-scale restoration projects, in particular for this oyster?
Yeah, so we're going through the risk assessment at the moment. It's a part of the business case, and it's a really challenging situation. For us in South Australia, I think the greatest ecological risk is trying to make, particularly for the larger reefs. So we're trying to scale up potentially to reefs that might be about 20 hectares. That's a really big change for a local ecosystem. It's a really big change for a regional area. So some of the risks will be around what are those actual changes in fish populations. That's one that we're going to be measuring very closely before and after. There is still the capacity, because of the substrate that we're using, for there to be some level of attraction of fish, and so we'll have to actually consider that with a lot of detail. The other one actually could be construction, and so we're going to have to be very conscious of how we actually do that and take our time. I think that will be a challenge for the local for the community to actually see that we're going to be unfolding this over time. To my mind, actually having any native oysters back in the water will be a good thing. So we don't think that there's a very strong genetic risk there, but we will be considering that and using local broodstock. And then the other one will actually be disease. The advantage that we have, we don't yet have a very extensive industry for native Angazi through aquaculture. However, we will be locating sites away from aquaculture farms just to make sure that there's no disease implications there. They're actually all still unfolding though, and we're sort of adding risks to the risk assessment as we go through it.